Welcome to episode 191 of the Women of the Military podcast. This week, my guest is Jill Chambers. Jill knew at age 10 that she wanted to join the military, and although she thought she would follow her father's career and join the Air Force, she ended up joining the Army after completing Junior ROTC and then receiving an Army ROTC scholarship. Through her time in the military, she saw many changes, supported Desert Storm from Korea, and was at the Pentagon on September 11th. We really dove into not only what it was like to be at the Pentagon, but the aftermath effect of PTSD and what being at the Pentagon after September 11th happened. So it's a really great episode, and we focused a lot on mental health and PTSD, and it's fitting. Yesterday was PTSD Awareness Day, and if you've been a long-time listener, you know how important mental health is, so I'm really glad I got to do this interview, and I hope that you enjoy it. Welcome to the show, Jill. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
So let's start with, why did you decide to join the military?
That's a great question. I actually decided when I was 10 years old that I was going to join the military. My dad was a career Air Force officer, and he had 5 brothers that were also serving in the military. I loved at least the first 10 years of my life as military brat, traveling around with my dad, my brother, and my mom. And it was just, I admired my dad so much, and I loved what he stood for when he talked about serving his country, that I just jumped right in and said, yep, this is what I'm going to do. So since 10 years of age, that was my plan.
And did you always know what branch of the military you wanted to join, or did that come later?
No, I thought the Air Force, just because of my dad, but I ended up getting an Army ROTC scholarship. And you can't just change branches like that. So my dad, who was terribly surprised that I was joining the Army, was still very proud. But that was Army, they paid my way. So that's exactly what I did.
That makes sense. Because if you're going to get your schooling paid for and the Army's going to do it, then that's the branch to join.
Exactly. Yeah. No arguing about that. So it's just the right thing to do. You're right.
So let's talk a little bit about ROTC and what the process was like. Did you apply for a scholarship in high school? Did you learn about it in college? How did you find out about ROTC and get the scholarship to go to school?
Well, that's a great question, too. I actually was in junior ROTC in high school. I was one of they just opened that up for women in 1974. So I was a sophomore in high school, and the first class that would actually have women be able to start in 74. I graduated high school in 76. And from there, I loved junior ROTC so much. Once I started college and joined ROTC there, the professors of military science were really awesome where I went to school. And they encouraged me right away, okay, get in on this, quickly sign up, do all the paperwork, let's get you an ROTC scholarship. So they really took me under their wing and were just some great guides for me through the whole ROTC process. And boom, next thing I know, I have the scholarship.
And was the JROTC Army as well?
Yes, it was. And even though my dad was like, okay, you can do Army ROTC as, in high school, that doesn't mean as much. But they didn't have Air Force ROTC where I went to high school. So I think I was just destined to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you got an Army ROTC scholarship and you went to school. Did you face any challenges while you were going through the ROTC program? I mean, you said women were just barely allowed to participate in junior ROTC. I'm guessing that ROTC would be similar.
It was similar. There certainly weren't a lot of women, but you know what? I didn't face any problems at all. I didn't try and be, one of the guys. I was just me, Jill, participating in something that I truly enjoyed. And I don't know, maybe I was just lucky, but the teams that I've been around were awesome. The men that were in the ROTC program, some of them still from college, I stay in touch with. We all, graduated together and went on our separate ways, but, a lot of us stayed together. So I really didn't face any challenges, big challenges like that. It was good team effort all the way.
That's great to hear. I had a really good experience in the military as well. And sometimes people ask me and I'm like, no, I just had good people that I worked with, and it was really a supportive environment. I think it's sometimes people just have really bad experiences and then other people have good experiences, and it just depends on who you meet and where you end up.
I completely agree. I'm so glad to hear you say that you had a great experience too. That's really nice. There's challenges, but nothing drastic, I would look upon all of that as a really wonderful journey in my life.
Yeah, so let's talk about you going on active duty and what your career field was, and if you went to training or if you went to base first. So, what that first year in the Army was like.
Sure. Well, once actually I graduated from college, they actually gave me, well, I asked for an education delay. So I went ahead and got a master's degree before I went straight into the Army. And that degree was in human relations and, public administration and human resources, because I really wanted to be an Adjutant General Corps officer to do personnel and work in that field. I liked all of that, everything that was revolved around, taking care of people. So once I graduated from graduate school, lo and behold, the Army in their infinite wisdom branched me as an ordnance officer to go blow things up. So needless to say, it was my first attempt at going back to the Army management, personnel management then in DC, and say, man, you guys just spent an awful lot of money for me to go to graduate school for this particular degree and get really good in human resources. Do you think I'd be better suited as an Adjutant General Corps officer? And lo and behold, I got a response back, and they did branch me in Adjutant General Corps. And I was sent off then right away to the officer basic course at Fort Ben Harrison for the Adjutant General Corps. So that started the whole thing.
That's funny. And it sounds like the military. They're like, we're going to pay for you to go do this. And then we're going to try and have you do something completely different. And then they're like, you're like, remember why you paid for this? And then they're like, oh yeah, okay, let's do that. So that's kind of funny. So after you went to that training, what was it like to go off into the Army? And I mean, college is kind of like you're on your own, but you're not really. So what was it like to like be in the Army, moving around as you go to all the different trainings? What was that experience like?
Well, I think I was lucky because I had it already sort of in my blood on what it's like to move and make friends and get along with people and just, I think most of my life I've just been happily in the flow. I mean, like, what's next? Okay, this is a new situation. What can I get out of this? What are the opportunities here? And what friends can I make? I've kept a positive attitude about a lot of this through my career. So even starting out right after, then getting out of graduate school, going to the basic course, and then my first assignment at Fort Bragg, again, lucky me, falling into the 18th Personnel and Administration Battalion with such an amazing group of quality service members. And, men and women, and the young soldiers and the old soldiers. And, the older ones took me under their wing, and the younger ones, it was fun to start to learn how to really mentor them and help them and solve problems and get them on the right track professionally and sometimes even personally. So it was through every single PCS move I had, I've gone in with that type of attitude, never really worried or concerned, more with eyes wide open and, okay, what is this adventure going to bring? So I guess it's just the way that I looked at everything, and it certainly helped, and I really loved it. I think that's what made my career so much fun.
Yeah. Did you join? You said you got delayed. I was like, was it like a 1982 when you went active duty? Did I do the
Right,
math right?
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, I graduated from Old Dominion University with my graduate degree in 1982 and went right off to the officer basic course.
So I've done enough interviews with people that I used to think there was nothing going on in the world in the 80s, and I know that's not true. So was there any situations or experiences that happened that you want to focus on between like 82 and 91 would be like the Gulf War?
Right. Yeah, it was a pretty quiet time, during those years. So a lot of the training, even if you're a personnel officer, you still need to do training to always prep if you're going to deploy. So we had a lot of those exercises. We'd go to the field and we'd do our missions and practice what we would do in wartime. So we were prepped, but up until 1991, really, there was no big major deployments, at least on my end.
Yeah. And then in 1991, the Gulf War happened. Were you deployed for that, or did you support it from the home station?
Yes, and that during that time I was actually in Korea. So we were all at that point, once that started, everybody who was in Korea, at least, we were frozen there. We couldn't leave, even if your DROS was up, you're staying. So we did a lot of support missions in terms of, whether people were on their way to Korea. Again, as a personnel officer, you're doing reassignments and, staging folks according to numbers. So we were in a lot of support of that.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I didn't really realize how important like all the back home support was for like a war that's happening until I deployed to Afghanistan, and like I went to Manus and like we in process there, and then we went to Bagram and we in process there, and then there were people back at home station training us, and so like I feel like there's so many different aspects, and a lot of times people only think about the people out fighting the battle and not all the support systems, both home and you were in Korea and other places around the world that are supporting to make the war happen.
Yeah, and good for, thank you for bringing that up because there is a lot of support that goes on behind the scenes, other than those who have deployed and the war fighters. So it does take a team, right?
It really does. It really does. So I wanted to ask, did you notice a change in the army? Because you said that you were doing a lot of exercises and training so that you would be ready for war, and then you were in during Desert Storm. And so, did the military or the army make changes on like how they trained, or was it pretty much the similar type of exercises?
At that point, it was really similar type of exercises. Things were certainly advancing from different wars previous, but not as dramatic as they do as you move through the 90s and into the 2000s, as you're well aware of, and our ability to train soldiers with much more the soldiers even have much more information, and it's not crossing a line and, oh, there's the enemy. The enemy's everywhere. I mean, it's at one point, we started to learn that even as an Adjutant General Corps officer, you always think, oh, we're behind the lines. We're way back. Nobody will ever get to us. Well, it doesn't work that way anymore. And we saw that change over the years, especially going into the 2000s, obviously. Everybody's at risk and everybody participates, and nobody's necessarily safe.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, and I think even I did some research a couple of years ago when I was doing a Memorial Day episode, and I was surprised that two women were killed back like far away from the fighting in a rocket attack. And so like that was something that happened in the 90s, and I'm sure but it was like they were back support. You would think that they were safe because they were far enough away, but that's the reality of war, is that no one's really safe because you're in a war zone and you don't know, like especially when there was a lot of incoming when you in the Afghanistan and Iraq war, and so it was like even if you were on the base you weren't safe.
Exactly. And that's the norm now, right? I mean, we're all, you once you deploy, you're a target. So you really just have to know your job and know how to protect yourself and protect your comrades too.
Yeah. So let's talk about between the end of Desert Storm and before September 11th. And you said that as you said, even like before September 11th, you said that as the 90s progressed, that things started to change. So what sort of things did you see change? And then we can talk about where you were on September 11th and what happened after that.
Sure. Well, honestly, for me, I was not in a force comm unit anymore. As we progressed into the 90s, I left Fort Eustis and ended up in Washington, D.C. So now I'm at PERSCOM, which is Army headquarters, doing officer assignments. So as far as training goes, honestly, I didn't see a whole bunch of that. Again, now we're little green suiters and we're in offices, not out in the field training. It wasn't until I moved over to from PERSCOM, which is in DC, over to the Pentagon in '98, and started working there. And again, it's the Pentagon. Well, that's a very safe place, don't you think? And of course, 3 years later, we had the attacks on the Pentagon on 9/11, and I was actually the military secretary for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time.
Well, I guess we need to stop and talk about that day because you were at the Pentagon on 9/11, and I've talked to a few people who were there, and they always have such interesting stories about either like not even knowing what was happening because they were on the other side of the building, or being closer to the incident or going in after and helping with support. So what was it like to be there, and what was your experience like?
Yes. Well, that morning, actually, before everything turned drastic, I was actually escorting one of our generals to a meeting down the hall. And we got about halfway to where this meeting was supposed to be. And someone yelled at him and said, "Get back to your office and look at the TV." So he turned around and hustled back and got him back to the office. And he saw the first plane had gone into the World Trade Center. And he turned to me and said, "Wow, that must have been like a little Piper jet, really miscalculated. And I agreed with him and I said, come on, sir, let's go. You're already late for the meeting. And we walk out, we're halfway down the hall again. And of course, then there's the second plane. And then, of course, we knew something terrible was happening in the world. So dropped him off and went back to my office. And again, I was the military secretary at the time. So my specific job was taking care of the 300 people that worked directly for the chairman, whether it was his legal guys, his public relations guys, his public affairs guys, all of those folks, his history folks, anybody that worked directly for him, I was responsible for taking care of them, which also included making sure that once a month we did these safety drills, which nobody participated in because these are all, I was a lieutenant colonel at the time, but these are all colonels and 1, 2, 3, 4-star generals. And they're like, yeah, just mark me down that I went outside and participated. Well, on that particular day, I've gone back to my office and we have a TV in our particular office. And my 2 sergeants were looking at the TV and escorting some of the chairman's dining room folks also worked for me. And they came across the hall and they're all these young kids and they're all in a panic. Oh my gosh, ma'am, these things happen in threes. It's like, okay, now we're getting a little silly and a little ahead of ourselves. Just stop worrying. And lo and behold, minutes after one of the service members had said that, one of my sergeants in the office who was on the phone with another woman downstairs on the first floor, we were up on the second floor and in a different part of the Pentagon, looked at me and said, oh my God, ma'am, I was just talking to Mildred and all of a sudden I heard this boom and she's not there. And that's, we all looked at each other at that point, and it was just seconds later that the black smoke started just billowing obviously around the Pentagon. And myself and my 2 sergeants, we got outside the building and looked around, and you could actually touch the black smoke as soon as we got out of the building because we were on the E-ring. So it was just, less than 50 yards for us to get out of the building. And the 3 of us looked at each other and was like, okay, something went wrong, but we got to go back in and account for these 300 people. So we knew where the staging area was. We found one person that knew where the staging area was, got that person there. And then the 3 of us went back inside and started getting the people out of their offices, getting them out of the building, getting them to the staging area. And that took almost 3 hours because some people ran the wrong way. Here's the good news. Out of all the people that worked for the chairman, everyone was safe. So we all got out. We were in, the plane hit near corridors 3, 4, and 5, and a little bit of 6. And we were over in corridor 8. So again, we were able to account for everybody, get everybody out, then move everybody from the Pentagon way over to Crystal City. And we were there until about midnight, waiting for buses to come through to pick up people because, the metro wasn't moving. Nobody was allowed to go back to their cars, just trying to get people home. So we were able to accomplish all of that. And the next morning we're back at the Pentagon. Some of us, not everybody. My team was, because again, we worked for the chairman and we needed to be there. And it was horrific. Everything about that was horrific. And I'm glad again that all of our people that we were caring for were okay. But where the plane hit, the ground zero for that plane was actually in the G1 office where Lieutenant General Maud worked. He was the only general that was killed. He was the G1, so he was like the father of all of the Adjutant General Corps. And a lot of my friends were actually there because that's where their offices were, and many of them were killed that day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Even though it's been so long, it brings back so many memories of that day. I was in California, so my version of 9/11 is interesting because we knew that by the time I had woken up to get ready for school, they already knew that something was going on. The second plane had hit, and it was interesting to hear it from people on the East Coast where it was like a normal day, and then all of a sudden everything changed. And then just to hear about how you knew people who died and how quickly their life ended and nobody knew it was coming. And so I'm sorry for the loss of friends, and just thank you for sharing and being so open to share your experience.
Oh, you're very welcome. Where in California were you?
I'm from Fresno. So
Okay, so you were in school that day?
yeah, I was a senior in high school.
Got it. Yeah, so it hadn't even happened before you even got to school, right? 3-hour difference.
Yeah, it happened. I think it happened at like 9. The first 2 towers are like 9 and
Right.
9:30, so it was like 6 and 6:30, and my alarm went off at 6:30, and the radio it was a radio alarm clock, and they weren't playing music, and they were talking, and I was like, "What is going?" And they sounded scared. I remember waking up and them sounding scared, and that was where I was like, "This doesn't make any sense," because it's not like a news update. It was like they were scared and unsure, and that they were dealing with, like, what was happening, and you could hear it in their voices from, like, the moment I woke up in the morning.
Right. Did you end up going to school that day or did they cancel school?
We had school, but we basically watched the TVs pretty much the whole day, and so we were at school, but I don't think we really did school.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So September 11th happened, and you were at the Pentagon, and you were working to account for people, and I'm sure there was lots and lots of moving pieces and lots of things going on. When did life kind of get back to like a normal ops tempo, or where that you guys started to move forward and maybe have like a normal day of work at the Pentagon?
Yeah, that took a couple years, honestly. They had us rotating. Not only was I the military secretary, but and this was all officers. Everybody was manning either the director of the joint staff or in the chairman's office 24/7. So nobody, we'd go home, but we were all on shifts. So it's not like the Pentagon ever shut down. And of course, it took quite a long time to rebuild the Pentagon, get the smell out. You could smell jet fuel every time you walked in that Pentagon for the longest time. And again, for the longest time, I mean, for months, it was, usually in the Pentagon, it's hustle bustle, people talking, it's slightly noisy. There were days where you could just hear a pin drop because people were just walking around a little numb. And it didn't help at all that a couple of times after 9/11, that the alarm system would go off and just freaking people out. Again, there's a little bit of post traumatic stress in there, like, oh my God, is this going to happen again? And we'd run the drills and get everybody out. And it was all of those that happened. And I would say it probably happened 3, maybe 4 times in the course of 2 to 3 months. And it was, nothing was happening except, escalating the fear in a lot of people. And, there's a lot of civilians that work in the Pentagon too that didn't go through necessarily any kind of military training. I mean, some were, retired and contractors and folks that work in there, but a lot of them weren't. And it's just, they don't expect anything like that to happen when they go to work. Just like people in the World Trade Center would have had no idea that that would happen. So it affects everybody differently, but it took a couple years for everything to honestly get back to normal.
Yeah, that's so insightful and something that I didn't even know. I guess I just figured, oh, a few months and then everything, but like the smell and like the reconstruction and like and even like, yeah, and the alarms going off and the fear, that's, that's like so interesting. I haven't heard anyone talk about like after working there. And so that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting throughout all of that. I can remember sometimes when the alarm actually went off the first time after 9/11, and we went around, to get people out, and there were some people who were literally frozen in their tracks. They could not move. They were able to stand up from their desk, and we had to physically start to get their feet to move so we could actually get them out of the door. They just ended up in a daze. And again, part of that is post traumatic stress. It's a real thing, and it can affect people in very different ways. Because then there's others who they hear the alarm and they're out like a bullet, out just out the door, but in sort of a manic way, not an organized, deliberate way. So you run the gamut from frozen still to shooting out like a star.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's part of why it's so hard to explain like mental health challenges, because everybody's experience is different and everyone's like coping method is different. So you can't be like, if you do A, B, and C, then you have PTSD, because you might have D, F, and L, and that is what is causing. And so it's like a combination, and it's really a challenge, I think, for me as an individual to go and get help, because I knew there was something wrong, but it didn't seem as bad as what other people were facing. And it wasn't until I finally went and got help that I was like, oh, there is something wrong, and there are ways to get better. Before, I just kind of was like, well, there must just be something wrong with me, and this is how life is. But I couldn't find the words or put it into words or really get help until I started. I did group therapy, and then I did one-on-one therapy, and both those things really helped me in my mental health journey. But it's what my experience was so different than like the stereotypical that was kind of stopped me from getting help for so long.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm so happy that you finally got to that place where you said, hey, you know what? I could use some help here. And that's, it's everyone's journey. They have to want to get help before help really even starts to make a difference for them. And that's one of the biggest lessons I learned out of everything from the Pentagon to the work I'm doing now. And you are 100% correct. There is no one cure for everybody because we are all individuals, all have different experiences. And even if we had the same experience, we're all going to interpret it differently. And that's, when professionals who are trying to help recognize that, that's where they make the most positive difference on a journey to help someone get better.
Yeah, for sure. When I first got home from Afghanistan, I tried to get help, and the therapist, instead of talking to me and like letting me work through it, was like, "Oh, you just got home, you'll be fine." And that was also part of why I didn't go get help, because I was told that I was fine right when I got home. And it took years before I like was finally to the point where I was like, "No, I'm not fine. There's something wrong." And I was able to get the help that I needed. And I found that a lot of times when people don't feel like they feel like something's off, but they can't explain it, people will be like, "You're fine. It's all right. Just get more sleep or go for a run," instead of stopping and saying that they like maybe we should listen to what this person is saying. My friend had postpartum depression, and she kept saying weird things that didn't make sense to me, but I was just like, she would be like, "I can't do that." And I'm like, "Yes, of course you can." And it wasn't until after she told me she had postpartum depression that everything kind of clicked. And so it kind of changed like how I listen to people and how I interact with people, especially close friends, when they start saying stuff that doesn't fit in line with what they normally say. I now realize that's a clue, and that I need to ask more questions and not just be like, "You're okay," because that's what happened to me and it really hurt me in my journey.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm glad that you were able to discern all of that. How many years was it from the time that that professional said, "Oh, you're just fine. You just got home. Get some sleep or whatever," until you finally got some help?
It was about 6 or 7 years, I think, between when I went to get help and when I got help.
Wow. Yeah. Well, um, yay for you getting help. And, I'm sure during those 6 years, you were scratching your head many times going, it still doesn't seem right. So thank goodness your journey got you to where you are now. And I love that you say that you stop and listen because most times that's one of the biggest things that can begin the journey for someone that's, ready to get some help is that someone's actually listening to them and not just nodding their head and spending a couple minutes and patting them on the back, tell them they'll be fine, and move on. So thank you for your caring spirit.
Thank you. It's been a long journey, but I think my experience has really helped me to have a platform to talk about it. And like, that's why I'm so passionate about it, because it happened to me and I want it not to happen to other people. And then I missed it in my friend. And not that I feel guilty, but it just made me realize like, even it though she wasn't saying like, "I feel like there's something wrong," she was just saying things that didn't seem to make sense. And then a couple weeks later, she's like, "I just was diagnosed with postpartum depression." And I was like, "Oh, now everything you said makes sense because I understand." But on the outside, everything seemed fine. Like I would have never said that she had postpartum depression because we were like going out doing things, and it didn't fit the stereotype I had in my mind until she told me like what happened.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that is she okay now?
Yeah, it was she told me that she woke up one day and it felt like she went from being in a dark room and like the lights were on, and she had gotten medication and was about to start taking it, and that was kind of when everything changed. It was like either it was the time of like after she had her baby or just like knowing what was going on helped her. But she is back to normal now. Or not back
Oh,
to
I'm so
normal,
glad to
but
hear that. Well, you made a difference whether you know it or not. And I'm sure, yeah, you guys, I'm sure, still friends and still talk with each other.
Well, she's in California because my husband's in the military, so we haven't talked in a while, but we're moving back to California, and so I hope to get reconnected with her. But yeah, I'm a military spouse and veteran, so life's a little crazy.
Yes, it is. I completely understand that.
So let's move past mental health and 9/11 and talk about the rest of your career. And I want to talk also about what you're doing today. So let's talk about post 9/11 and any highlights that you want to cover.
Sure. Well,